Well, Neil Howe is on the telephone. He is an historian, economist, a demographer. Mr. Howe is the founding partner of the consulting firm Life Course Associates. He is retained by major corporations, nonprofit organizations, government agencies to provide consultation on historical patterns and cycles and generational attitudes and behavior. He is a recognized authority on aging, on long-term fiscal policy and migration. His current titles include Public Policy Advisor to the Blackstone Group, Senior Advisor to the Concord Coalition, and Senior Associate to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I will tell you this, after this interview, I encourage you to buy the book and take your time reading it and digesting it. Neil Howe, welcome to True News.
Great to be here, Rick.
I think you can tell I'm excited about your book.
I'm getting excited just listening to you here.
Well, listen, I don't know how I missed this book for so long. I'll tell you what, I put it on the level of Future Shock. And I personally knew Alvin Toffler many years ago as a young man. In fact, I almost went to work for Mr. Toffler. He asked me to consider being his research assistant when he was writing The Third Wave. And this book, I've not had any book hit me as hard as this book since I read Future Shock, and that's 30-some years ago. Let's talk about, I don't know where to start with this. King Solomon said there's a time and a season for everything. And I think that's really the basis for your book. So,
well, yes, it is, and that is a fundamental theme of the book. It's just even how we think about time. I think that in the modern world, certainly all of us who live in the West since the French Revolution, and certainly the whole the zeitgeist of modernity has been to think about time, social time, in a linear fashion, right? Progress. Everything goes in one direction. Technology gets better. GDP rises. We all live longer lives, right? Whatever it is, it goes one direction. We all become democracies, right? We all believe in human rights, or whatever it is. And it's linear toward one destination. That might be totally a secular destination. That might be what was well known to all of the big monotheisms. Is linear time toward the end of time, right? And I think that often this is an energizing assumption about where we're going, particularly when things are going well. But sometimes when things start going not so well, it becomes a particularly despairing viewpoint, right? We tend to think, well, everything is in decline in a linear way, right? It will just keep going down forever. So the very linear assumption that makes us happy in good times sometimes makes us really, we find, depressing in bad times. And I think particularly in recent decades in the United States, some people have moved into what's sometimes called postmodernism, which is instead of a linear view of time, is a completely chaotic time. Everything is random. Nothing necessarily follows anything else. The way events follow each other is kind of arbitrary. It's complex in a way that no one can figure out. I've been intrigued recently, in recent years, to see a new genre of fiction called counterfactual history. I don't know if you kind of partake in this genre. What happened if Japan and Nazi Germany had won World War II? What would have happened if, Napoleon had won at Waterloo? What would have, right? That kind of thing. It's sort of a completely different sort of world in describing it. But there is one other way of looking at time, which has actually been much more important historically up until the last couple of centuries, and still is very important in traditional societies, and still is the way we look at a lot of things in our lives. And that is to look at time cyclically, seasonally. This is the way we look at the seasons of the year, right? And even in the great monotheisms, Christianity and Islam and so on, we celebrate seasonal holidays and we think about seasonal times of the year as being expressive of the broader pattern of history. So all of us have some experience about seasonality. You know, if you live in an agrarian society, you do your harvest in the fall, you prepare for the winter. Come the early spring, you go out and you clear the fields and you plow them and you plant, and you know, life is seasonal. And we came about, Bill and I, we had written a book about 6 years earlier than The Fourth Turning. This came out in 1991. I want to backtrack a little bit because I think it will give you some sense of how we got to this idea.
Okay.
But we wrote a book called Generations, The History of America's Future. And what we did in that book, and it took a long time to write, it took the two of us about 3 years of research and writing.
The History of America's Future.
Yes. It was called,
I like that title.
Yeah, Generations, The History of America's Future. And we were fortunate enough to get a pretty good advance from a major publisher, so that it enabled us to take some time out of our lives to do this book. But what it is a... And it's still worth reading, by the way. It is a history of America from the 17th century onwards. So from the first, Puritan settlers or Chesapeake settlers in the 1620s or 30s onward, all the way till today, but told in a completely different way than anyone's viewed history before. Typically, when we read history, we read about we read about people of all ages every single year, right? So it's 1843, what's everyone doing? What are leaders doing? What are kids are doing? Then the next year, 1844, what's everyone doing, right? And typically we focus mostly on midlife people because they're the leaders and the presidents and the generals, right? And that's kind of how we look at history. We came up with a completely different way of looking at it, and that was to look at history generationally. So why don't we start with people born, say, in the, 1600 to 1620, and let's look just at them throughout their lives. How were they children? How were they raised as kids? How was their courtship? What wars did they experience coming of age? How did they got integrated into the economy? How did they behave as midlife leaders and parents? How did they, in old age, look back over everything they had done? And how did they look at older generations when they were young, younger generations when they were old? And then once we finish that collective story, start with the next generation, right? Born right after them. And what you find is that even though these even neighboring generations experience many of the same events, they have completely different interpretations of them because they experience them at different ages, right? So one generation comes of age during a war, the next generation experiences that from a child's point of view, right? And so on through subsequent phases of life. And not only, and we marched on and we did this for all of American history, and not only did we find that different generations all view life differently, but this is the most remarkable thing. We found that there was actually a recurring pattern or sequence in the types of generations that seem to follow each other. That is to say, if you look at the overall life plan of each generation and the characteristic attitudes and behaviors of each generation, were they civic-minded or were they more libertarian, right? Were they risk-seeking or were they risk-averse? Did they get along well with their parents or did they, resent and explode at their parents? All of these things. We find that we actually characterize different kinds of generations.
How many of these
four
groups?
Four types of generations, and they recur in the same order, with one interesting exception, a slight exception after the Civil War, which I think is interesting, and it says something about the unique role of the Civil War in our history. And this is also something we've investigated, not just in America, but in European and in other societies around the world, in Asia in particular. And we think it has a great deal of sort of cross-cultural validity, particularly in modern societies.
How far back into history did you study?
Well, in the Fourth Turning, we took the sort of Anglo-American experience all the way back to the end of the Middle Ages, really, the War of the Roses. So we went back many centuries there.
500 years or so?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you found the same pattern.
The same pattern. And then what happened is at the end of the book, we sort of said, well, given there is this pattern, and given that each of these types of generations has the same relationship with the big events in its life, it almost directly implies a pattern of history itself. So basically, at the end of generations, we sort of discuss this broader cyclical pattern of history. And in the book, The Fourth Turning, which you read and came out in 1997, we sort of turned it all around. We started with the idea of cycles in history. And many of the cycles that people have observed, cycles of war, cycles of family life, cycles of drug abuse, cycles in the economy, the long wave, the so-called K wave in the economy, demographic cycles. And we basically say, you look at all these cycles, they all have sort of a common beat to them. And we said that beat can be explained by this notion of shifting, predictable shifts in generational archetypes. Generations are shaped by history young in predictable ways, and then as they reach midlife and they reach maturity, they themselves shape history, which in turn shapes the next generation of young people. So this is what we saw. Now, the next kind of logical question is, well, what is this cycle, right? And what kind of cycle are we talking about? And what we see is a seasonal cycle, and marked by four what we call turnings or seasons, each one roughly the length of a human generation. So it's going to be around the length of a phase of life, the time that passes between being born and coming of age fully as an adult. So we're talking about 20 plus years, 20 years and a little change, 22, 23, something like that. And each of these seasons in a row, if you add them all up, you're talking about something about every 80 or 90 years or so. And the first of these seasons we call a high. This is a period, this is a post-crisis period. We all recall, for instance, the American high, right after World War II. These would have been the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And highs, particularly, or first turnings, particularly in American history, are eras when institutions are strong, individualism is weak, society feels a strong collective confidence about where they want to go into the future. There's great emphasis upon belonging and conformity. Vernon Parrington, the historian, once called these the great barbecues of American history. Sometimes, very often, minorities or groups who aren't fit in are excluded, and this is characteristic of this period. A second turning, which always follows a high, is called an awakening. And these are periods, we're kind of moving from spring to summer here. These are periods when suddenly everyone tires of all of the emphasis on social obligation. Everyone wants to throw off all of that obligation. Everyone wants to refine themselves, some genuineness of belief, of passion, of feeling again. And the society individuates. Everyone begins to succeed in finding themselves. We all recall in America the period, the period of what we sometimes call the consciousness revolution, right? The period which began in the mid-'60s and lasted all the way through the '70s into the early '80s. It started with the inner city riots and the campus revolts, in mainly rebellion in the culture, and ultimately ended up with deregulation and tax cutting. But you see, whether or not it's the economy or in culture, the direction was always the same: less social obligation, more freedom for individuals to do as they wish. And ultimately, it went from the culture all the way through to the economy. And so we had this incredible individualization of American society in that period, completely unpredicted by anyone back in the late 50s or early 60s. If you had been looking at generational rhythms, you might have predicted it. But, all the great social scientists of that time, Margaret Mead and Erik Erikson, and none of these people predicted it. Well, they should have seen it. They should have seen it coming if they had really known about the character, the collective temperament of the generation that was born after World War II. They should have been able to predict something. Now, many historians talk about these events in the late 60s and 70s, this consciousness revolution, as America's fourth or fifth Great Awakening, depending on when you want to start your first Great Awakening with, John Winthrop in the 1630s or Jonathan Edwards in the 1740s. These Great Awakenings throughout American history, both in religion, in culture, and in values, have been huge moments, great moments of disruption in American history. They've always caused tremendous pain and turmoil within families, and they've always been spearheaded by the young who claim the virtue of a new religion of the heart as opposed to a religion of the head, a new emphasis on salvation by faith over salvation by works. And, you don't have to dig too deep into the boomer psyche to realize that much of that was behind, what their indictment of their World War II winning parents, right? Always focus on duty, always focus on achievement. Boomers had a new way. Now, the third turning we call an unraveling, and this is in many ways the opposite of a high. In an unraveling, institutions are weak, individualism is strong. These are, the great unraveling decades in American history would be the 1990s, the 1920s, the 1850s, the 1760s. These were all decades of cynicism and bad manners. Civic authority felt weak. The popular culture felt, exhausted. Personal life felt frenetic. And these are, in many ways, I say the opposite of a high, because if you go into a bookstore during a third turning, and to some extent it's even still true today, you find out all the upbeat books are about me, myself, and I, right? I'm great. I can do anything. I can be a success. And all the downbeat books today in a bookstore are all about what we share collectively, right? The end of society, the end of family, the end of politics. You know what I mean, Rick, right?
That's right.
That's because we've been living in a third turning, right? And history suggests that a third turning is always followed by a fourth turning. And this is a period when under urgency, even under the shadow of a crisis to the nation's very survival, we tear down and rebuild institutions from scratch. And we're talking about outer world institutions, things like the economy, politics, government, empire. These are the times when, and history shows that if a crisis doesn't appear, a fourth turning leader will actually invent one in order to galvanize collective action. The pop culture reassumes purpose again, often under the guise of propaganda. People beginning to find each other in larger groups. Community begins to revive, typically starting with young people. And ultimately, all of these fourth turnings in American history have all basically been eras in which we redefined our very identity as a nation. This happened during the American Revolution. It happened during the Civil War. It happened during the Great Depression and World War II. And, you can count the years, Rick. I mean, these are all separated by about, 80-something years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you go back in time and you see the same relationship between the American Revolution and, of course, the Glorious Revolution, when we were a part of Britain and we were basically transforming our total empire into a constitutional monarchy, and so forth. We find this to be a very powerful rhythm, and others have noticed something similar. Arnold Toynbee, the historian, once said that he noticed that the great wars seemed to be separated about the length of a long human life, and he often said that his generational theory was basically generational forgetting. He said the generation that doesn't remember the last war is the ones that, when they get to be old, take the country into the next one, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we do think he understood the fundamental concept. Think of it this way. In this what we call a saeculum, which is the Latin word for century, but it originally meant the length of a long human life. It's a word that actually might have originally come from Etruscan. But this saeculum, think of it as having 4 seasons, and think of the 2 extreme seasons to be the awakenings and the crisis. So the awakenings are times when society reshapes its inner world of vision, values, culture. And the winter, the 4th turning, is when we reshape our outer world of community, institutions, and empire. And the kinds of generations that come of age in those different eras are very unalike. The GI generation, the greatest generation, came of age during a crisis, right, our last 4th turning. And the generation which came of age during the subsequent awakening were boomers. And then the generation that's beginning to come of age today is the millennial generation, and they too represent a huge shift back towards something that we haven't seen in a long time in America, a generation a bit more risk-averse, closer to their families, and hugely more oriented toward trust in institutions and a belief in community. And anyone who doesn't see how these kids gravitate toward community has not been on any social network sites or has not seen how these kids use cell phones or IM.
Mr. Howe, I want to just to recap, so listeners who are being introduced to the 4th turning for the first time can follow along with what we're talking about. First of all, you, Mr. Strauss, you talked in your book about a cycle called a saeculum. This was an ancient term. Is this pre-Roman history? How far back? Where did you find saeculum?
As I was mentioning, many of the Romans themselves believed that this word is a non-Latin word, that it came from the Etruscans, who may have even been a non-Indo-European speaking culture who lived in Italy, at the same time or even prior to the Latin tribes, and so it is an ancient word. And
so they measured time in this cycle called a saeculum.
Yes.
And it meant a length of a long human life.
Apparently, it was interesting. According to legend, the way it was measured among the Etruscans, and the Romans attempted to do this during the early Republic, is at any given moment, the youngest person who lived the longest. In other words, when you measure the time from 1 year, and then you looked at the year when the last person alive during the first year was still alive, right? So in other words, the longest lived child at 1 year was alive on the next year, which may be, I don't know, let's say that's 98 years or something. Then that was the end of the saeculum, and then you started your measurement again in that year by looking at the youngest kids then and how long they would live to the end of the subsequent saeculum. So it's a kind of unique and unusual way of measuring time.
Right, okay, so now inside this saeculum, which could be anywhere from roughly 90 to 100 years, there are 4 turnings. Your first turning you have labeled a high. That's like the spring of the season. The second is an awakening. That's the summer. The third is an unraveling. That's the fall. Then the 4th turning is a crisis. That's the winter stage. Now, the other thing I feel like we need to help the audience understand is going back to the very beginning in the dividing the seasons of life for each generation from birth to age 20, 22 is one group, and then from, say, 22, 23 to, early 40s?
Yes, that would be what we call rising adulthood, and then from the early to mid-40s to the mid-60s, that's midlife, and then, mid-60s to late 80s would be elderhood, and then of course a lot of people are living beyond that. We could even call late elderhood or something like that. So,
and what do you call that first group? Is it just young adult?
Childhood, young adult, midlife, and elderly, if you want to put it in terms of 4 groups.
Okay, so we have from birth to early 20s is childhood, then early 20s to early 40s is rising adult, early 40s to mid 60s, midlife, and then from mid 60s to death is elders.
Right.
Okay, now where they're born, okay, where each one of these subgroups, where they are born in the saeculum, the first turning, second turning, third turning, or fourth turning, that determines their attitude, their behavior?
That determines their generational archetype and will determine, for most of them, where the center of gravity of this generation is going to be. So, for example, if you were, those who were born during the first turning, of course, we know who all those were. The most recent first turning, those who were born during that time, are boomers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know who they are. Those who were born during the awakening and were raised as little kids during that period are Generation Xers. These are Americans born in the 60s and 70s. And the Xer experience growing up was one of an exploding divorce rate, childless devil horror movies, Judy Blume and latchkey guides, and parents who basically said, "Grow up on your own."
Mm-hmm.
and this is very important in shaping Generation X's attitudes toward authority and community, survivalism. We still have reality shows and survivor shows are now watched by people in their 40s, right? It's the same generation; they're just older.
What I find so fascinating about your work is that you and Mr. Strauss studied history going back 500 plus years in British American history. You didn't study the whole world. You focused on British American history. Is that correct?
Yes, in that book.
Okay.
Yes.
So going back over 500 years, you found the same pattern repeating itself every 80, 90, 100 years. The same generational attitudes, behaviors, the same cycles, the high awakening, unraveling, the crisis. You found this happening over and over and over.
Yes, with obviously with different technologies, with different stage of social complexity, with populations of different size. So obviously things change. From century to century, even from decade to decade. But when you abstract from that, when you look beneath all of that into the underlying sort of social and emotional dynamic going on, both within the generation and between generations, you see the same dramas repeating. There's an old saying by Mark Twain that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that's what we're looking at. The rhyming is the sense people have that they've seen this before, or maybe I haven't personally seen it before, but it happened in my parents' or grandparents' time.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about when I was a child, who were the oldest people that I recall in my family, in my life, and my great grandmother would have been born, I'm just guessing, sometime in the late 1860s, early 1870s?
Maybe, depending on how old she was and how old you were. So,
right. Because my grandparents were born in the 1890s. Okay, so...
Right.
So my grandmother's mother would have been born, 20 some years earlier than that. So, I'm trying to.
Rick, here's an interesting thing that we sometimes ask people to think about, and that is the amazing length of people's what we sometimes call their living generational memory span. So think of this. Think of the oldest person who knew you as a young child, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that let's say that's your grandmother or great-grandmother when you were a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in my case, maybe that's certainly someone born in the mid-1880s. And then think of the youngest person you are likely to know before you pass away. Now, for many of us today, that's someone who may live until, 2100, right?
Yes.
That is your living generational memory span.
Wow.
In that case, 1880s to 2100, you're talking about 220 years. That's as long as the United States has been a nation, right? We forget sometimes how long we reach and how much experience in our own lives we have of these cycles.
My son and I were having a conversation about your book one night. He hadn't read it yet, but I was telling him about it. I was talking about this very subject, and I was having him project out for his children. They don't have children yet, but they just got married. And I said, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. And I was trying to get him to understand that concept of when he was born, the oldest person he knew, and then the youngest child he would know, great-grandchild at the end of his life. It was blowing him away.
Right.
It is a mind-boggling concept to measure time and our influence and the influences that have shaped our lives, our attitudes, our behavior. So, okay, what does this have to do with the price of bread? Bring that.
or maybe more to the point, the price of gold and the price of corn and the value of the euro.
Yeah, now you're talking. All right.
Well, we often have people ask us, of course, since The Fourth Turning came out. It's an interesting book in terms of its sales because it remains very much in print and very much alive.
Does it have turnings also?
What?
Does the book have its own turnings?
Well, all of our books remain in print. But The Fourth Turning is interesting because, of course, it has had a huge surge of interest, particularly over the last decade. Every time there's a sign that, Francis Fukuyama's end of history is not quite where we're going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that certainly was true around the time of 9/11. And it's even more true, I think, even more accentuated with the financial meltdown of 2008, where people, and this, by the way, is where we tentatively date the beginning of what we think is the fourth turning in America. So, starting in 2008, again, think of it, this will be a period that will last 20-odd years, maybe somewhere between maybe 22, 24 years, something like that. And so, this is a period that will be lasting, throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, perhaps near the end of that time. And so this is a long era. It's not just a couple-year event. It's an era, just like the Great Depression and World War II was a long era. And I think that that we're beginning to see some huge changes and some huge shifts in perspective. Now, keep this in mind as you're thinking about these turnings, that every turning represents each generation moving into the next phase of life, right?
That's right.
So that, for example, when the awakening hit in the mid-'60s, boomers were just beginning to move into young adulthood. The silent generation that was born and raised during the first turning was beginning to, they were beginning to enter midlife. They were beginning to take over leadership positions. And the GI generation, which ran America at that time, they ran America, and with Dean Rusk and LBJ and General Westmoreland, they were getting us into Vietnam and all of that. That was the generation that was running America, and they were just beginning to retire, right? They were just getting their Social Security checks and moving down to Leisure World and Sun City and all that. And so that was that transition. As we moved into the third turning in the mid-1980s, again, every new generation. So that was when Generation X began to come of age. Boomers began to first push into midlife, and the silent generation beginning to retire. And of course, now with this fourth turning, we're again just one generation removed. So now it's the boomers who are beginning to retire. Xers who are beginning to move into midlife. They're beginning to become our CEOs, our generals. In the case of Barack Obama, born in 1961, we have an example of someone now in the White House who exemplifies what Obama himself calls, a post-boomer generation mentality he often talks about. And then you have a new generation, this millennial generation, born since the early 1980s, beginning to enter young adulthood and beginning to hugely redefine how we think of students, soldiers, young workers in the workplace, with very different a set of behaviors and habits. And all of those combined serve to change the entire national mood. And we think this particular change that's going on now is one that's leading us into this new period of urgency, crisis, and institutional rebirth. So if Americans feel that they don't trust institutions right now, they think big change might be happening in not very long, they're right. Let me just add one thing, though, because people sometimes tell me, well, this sounds apocalyptic. This just sounds nothing but horrible news. And it's not horrible. America has been through many fourth turnings before. And although they are dangerous, wars that we fight in fourth turnings have tended to be total wars. In fact, in our own experience, they've all been total wars. And the kinds of crises we have are certainly challenging. There are great aspects of fourth turnings. To begin with, at the end of the fourth turning, we totally solve huge challenges that elude us for decades before the fourth turning. It's a time when issues of loose nukes around the world, or in the environmental problems, or the over-leveraging of their economy and the national debt, things like that will achieve a definitive solution. The fact that we don't know how to balance the budget, right? What are we going to do with all those unfunded liabilities? So many of these issues will be solved in the same way. When you came out of World War II, we didn't just win the war. We demanded unconditional surrender. We founded the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods, right? The dollar became the... We put into place institutions that lasted for decades after that to stabilize the world. And that's what happens at the end of a fourth turning. And that provides a stable future for a glorious time for much of the world after that. So there are good things to come out of a fourth turning. And one last thing to mention, and this was certainly true in the memories of many GIs you talk to today. Talk to people today in their late 80s or early 90s about the experience of the Great Depression and World War II. And many of them will tell you that although it was a time of material challenge and deprivation and a time of great danger for many, it was also a time that they often remember with great nostalgia and fondness, because it was a time that brought everyone together in a way which they hadn't been during World War I of the 1920s. It was a great collective moment for the country. There was something special that they remembered for the rest of their lives, even if their boomer kids later on didn't understand that kind of fellow feeling.
Mr. I want to read from your book just a paragraph so our audience can capture here what the essence of what you are telling us is happening right now to the USA. Chapter 10, A Fourth Turning Prophecy. Again, the book was published in 1997. You wrote, sometime around the year 2005, perhaps a few years before or after, America will enter the fourth turning. In the middle of the OOs, America's will be very different society than in the late 20s, when the last crisis catalyzed. The nation will be more affluent, enjoy better health, possess more technology, encompass a larger, more diverse population, and command more powerful weapons. But the same could be said about every other unraveling era society compared to its predecessor. They were not exempt from the saeculum, nor will we be. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. A spark will ignite a new mood. Today, the same spark would flame briefly, but then extinguish its last flicker, merely confirming and deepening the unraveling era mindset. This time, though, it will catalyze a crisis. In retrospect, the spark might seem as ominous as a financial crash, as ordinary as a national election, or as trivial as a tea party. And then you go on to describe various scenarios of what could happen: a fiscal crisis, a terrorist attack, and you have a number of scenarios. That was eerily prophetic.
Yes, it's amazing. I think I was sort of astonished. I'd even forgotten it, but I was on some TV show not long ago when someone was reading that, and I think a little bit after that, I think this was in August of last year. You know, remember during the debt limit crisis, and I think one of our fourth turning scenarios was actually a refusal of Congress to raise the debt limit.
Yes, that's in it also.
And that the president declares emergency powers, and so anyway, it was an interesting little set of scenarios. And look,
it's spooky. I'll be honest with you. That chapter is spooky.
I mean, our effort was not. I mean, I'm not Nostradamus or anything like that. I really have my capacities to predict actual events is very ordinary, is not any better than really anybody else who reads the news.
Mm-hmm.
What we try to do is something else. What we try to do and what we think can be done is predict the changes in attitudes and behavior by age bracket and the consequent change in the mood of the entire society that makes certain kinds of events more likely than others as we move from one year to the next, one decade to the next.
Okay.
I think if you look at it that way, I think you understand what we're trying to do.
Okay, we've got about 12 minutes remaining, and I've got 1,000 other questions. Okay, so looking back now, I mean, in 97, you said somewhere around 2005, give or take a year or two, America will go into the fourth turning. It's crisis season. Now looking back from this vantage point of 2012, do you think that was 2008?
I think now 2008. It's interesting. A lot of people thought that 9/11. A lot of our readers, a lot of our fans, they say, well, 9/11 is it. We're in the fourth turning. We thought not. Although even despite the fact that obviously, particularly in the year after 9/11, there was an enormous and palpable change in the national mood. I think anyone has to agree. The problem is that it was too early. None of the generations were yet moving into the next phase of life. Millennials were just the first millennial was graduating from high school. Boomers weren't yet retiring. And simply going on the historical record, we say, these changes really begin to happen once every generation starts redefining the next phase of life and the functions of those phases of life.
And so those generational cycles started to converge around 2008.
Yes. Now events can determine the actual year. This is not, you cannot do this with astronomical accuracy. So at the margins, a few years either way, events sort of cause generations and cohorts to gravitate a little bit earlier, a little bit later. I mean, think of the kind of prediction you can make with this. It's not like the prediction of an orbiting planet, where you can do it to exact second and minutes and seconds of arc. It's more like the predictions you make of a complex system, like the budding of a flower, the arrival of the first frost, right, in the wintertime. You know it's going to happen, right? There's a very complex set of sort of dynamics leading up to that event, but it's almost impossible to tell, given the chaotic complexity of the process, exactly when it's going to happen. And I think that turnings and generational dividing lines are like that. They can be influenced at the margins by events. But the underlying trend, I think, tends to force events and cannot be fundamentally influenced by them.
Okay, if America entered the fourth turning of this latest saeculum, which is an 80 to 100 year cycle of time, and we entered the fourth turning of the latest saeculum, and that happened in 2008, then this turning, this season, this winter season, is going to last, 20 to 22 years?
Yeah, probably last to the late 2020s, even all the way through to 2030, and it will go through discrete stages. There will be the trigger, and the deepening sense of distrust, feeling that the country's lost, a sense of even deepening sense of things falling apart or falling beyond our control. Then there will be a moment of regeneracy. Typically, when the challenge becomes urgent, people realize something has to be done, and that's when very slowly civic energy will start regalvanizing, and then there will be a climax, and that will be a time when we pass through the worst of the risk. Right? Somehow we in some way with our refound determination and our ability to come together, we find some way, whether together or separate groups or however we do it, we find some way of getting through the worst of it. And then the final stage in a crisis is the resolution. This is when the treaties are signed, the new organizations are set up that's to run the post-crisis world, and as soon as the ink is dry on those treaties and everyone, the celebrations are over, that's when we enter the next first turning. And institutions are very fluid and plastic during the fourth turning. New ones can be born, they can be easily reshaped, but as soon as the crisis is over, they all begin to harden again, right? Suddenly it's very difficult to change anything.
Typically, how late into the fourth turning does the climax stage come?
Typically late. So, typically late. I mean, think of the whole period from 1929 through 1946. Mm-hmm. I mean, the climax really wasn't until 1943, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that was the climax of World War II for us. Maybe some of the very far-sighted or prescient could have seen that Stalingrad and El Alamein was the turning point in the fall of 1942. But I think for most of America, they had to wait for 1943 until many people began to think, but such is the mood of a fourth turning, that even though we thought we were winning, we still went ahead, designed, built, and used a weapon of mass destruction against another country. And I think that's one thing we have to remember, too, is that the mood of a fourth turning is very different. When entire societies feel in peril and under and are galvanized to take total action to solve a problem, we sort of make the decision to do certain things that maybe when we're in a different collective mood we wouldn't have decided to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to recap this, America has entered its fourth turning. It started 2008. This season, this winter season, it's a crisis season. It's going to last a long time. It may not end until the late 2020s, even up to 2030. And towards the latter part of this crisis season, there will be a climax, which is the low point of the crisis where it can't get any worse.
Or the high point.
It could be the high point.
It could be the high point in the sense by then the regeneracy is well underway, so we feel a tremendous sense of civic energy and cooperation. The problem is that the problem has gotten larger too. I mean, one can imagine, for instance, let's put this in the context, for instance, of a financial or economic crisis, right? Mm-hmm. By the time it's a climax, we could be impoverished. Our debt could all be worthless. Our currency could be repudiated, right? But by then, we feel tremendous determination to overcome it, to pay back the debts, to reinvest in the infrastructure. So, do you understand? It may be a time of great deprivation, but by then it's a time of great common purpose. The climax is when that common purpose actually overcomes the worst of the challenge facing it. Then we coast toward resolution.
All right, I've got about 3.5 minutes. The war cycle, where does this fit in right now with this current fourth turning?
Well, I think that everyone hopes that the fourth turning does not involve a major war. I certainly do. I mean, I'm an historian here. I just observe what's going on.
And we all do, but are we overdue for a big one?
Well, we're overdue for a big crisis. We're overdue for great adversity, urgency, and all the other things I talked about. It could take forms other than war. It could include a war. The last time it included both a Great Depression and a war, and that could certainly happen. But I don't make any prediction as to how much of each it might include, or whether, or in what form the war might take as well. As you know, with asymmetrical warfare and all the different ways in which adversaries might decide to wage war, it becomes a little harder now even to predict that.
All right, now I've got to really speed this one up because the clock is ticking. So at the end of this crisis, which will be late 20s, maybe 2030, then the next cycle, we go back to the first turning, which is the high, the spring.
Yep.
Then the awakening doesn't come to the second turning. So based on these numbers, what year, what decade would you project will be the next spiritual awakening in America?
Late 2040s.
2040s.
And a lot of the kids that late wave millennials will have. So a lot of the kids that will eventually be in the families of millennials age, who are teenagers today. A lot of them will strike out in a passionate and furious and angry protest against all of the marvelous things these millennials have built, both at the climax of this coming fourth turning and the first turning to follow. And these millennials will feel so proud of everything they have done in their by what then will be these enormous Facebook confederations, right? And their children will feel nothing but hatred for them. And that will be the birth of another very culturally creative era of American history.
Will you come back on the program maybe in a month after our audience gets a chance to read your book?
Sure, I can come back, and I can't promise the exact time.
I know.
Not too long.
Okay, because we have just scratched the surface of this. My guest today, Mr. Neil Howe, and he is the co-author along with the late William Strauss. The book is The Fourth Turning. And I thank you so much, Mr. Howe. Thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you, Rick. It was a delight.